All right, we're going to call strategy session number 8 to order. It's the war on charter schools and combating the emerging threats to public school choice. And I just want to make 2 quick announcements. Before you leave, don't forget to pick up WIN notepads and WIN pens. They're very nice. And there is going to be another snack session between 3:15 and 3:30. And we're strongly encouraging you to eat because you won't get supper until 8. So I'm going to remind you that before you leave. And, of course, I'm sure our speakers will be very thankful if you'll fill out your evaluation forms and leave them with us as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Jeanne Allen. Thank you.
That's right, because our evaluations are pegged to our compensation,
Yeah.
which is 0 except for all those great snacks. Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Get your blood sugar levels back in gear, because this is going to be an exciting, interesting session on charters if you guys are willing to participate and have a little fun and maybe do some arguing and debating as well. I'm Jeanne Allen. I'm president of the Center for Education Reform. It's my pleasure to join Jeb Bush and his great Foundation on Excellence in Education for this panel. Charter schools have come up, it seems like, just about every session multiple times. So I'm always a little bit, even though it's one of 4 or 5 things the Center for Education Reform does, I'm always a little bit, kind of feeling down that it wasn't like a huge, huge piece, because it really is something that every single state policy maker is struggling with right now in a myriad of ways, some more successful than others. So on this panel, what we thought we'd do is take you through a little tour of 3 things: what the local perspective is as far as not just developing and running great schools, but what it is that tends to clash sometimes on a policy level that often is inadvertent, frankly, not intentional, when folks like you in the room and other interested parties get into building charter school policy. Work up through the state level and talk a little bit, in this case in the state of Florida, of what has happened that might influence, in a good or bad way, the development of great high-quality charter schools. Come on in. There's lots of seats out front. And finally, the national level, which John Hage will carry you through, not just working in states, but being aware as an active participant and a leader on a national level in what's going on. And frankly, we want to answer questions like, how does Race to the Top have anything to do with charter schools? Is it good? Is it bad? Whether it's charter schools, charter schooling, the development of a law, what does that look like? What kinds of advice should we be giving to policymakers? What kind of advice can policymakers give us? And again, I come back to that sort of law of unintended consequences. It is just simply amazing to me how many times great things are written down and they result in absolute junk when it comes to actual policy implementation. And maybe that's just my cynicism, having been in Washington for almost 25 years and having worked in the federal government, lots with state governments, and certainly at a local level. So before I directly introduce our panelists and ask them to engage us in a conversation, I want to talk to you a little about some common misconceptions, maybe ruffle a few feathers. T. Willard Fair in the back, as well as talk about some things that maybe would set up our panel in a good way. First of all, just because we know that not everyone has a common definition, I think it's really important that we all get on the same page with regard to what charter schools are, and I am still always amazed at how difficult it is sometimes to get that common definition. So for us, a charter school is a public school open by choice, accountable for results, free from most of the grueling rules and regulations that bind them, that bind most other traditional schools. And that accountable for results, I think, is really critical. How are they accountable for results? Lots of different ways, obviously, but my second set of misconceptions is how often we hold just the school leaders accountable for the result and never talk about the actual process of authorizing or the law that allowed them to come into existence. Oftentimes, some of our biggest problems have to do with the way the law is written, not with the particular school. So for a group like this, it is like having candy in a jar right next to me, because frankly, it's really, really important to understand when you stand up and say, we got a bunch of lousy charter schools in Cleveland, or I got some problems in Florida, or whatever, that there may be some things that you could fix so that never happens again, either in the beginning or on the end, but hopefully in the beginning to start with. Finally, another misnomer, and I've heard it, and I've even heard it from my dear friend and our host, Jeb Bush, when it comes to constitutionality. The issue of writing a law that challenges the status quo, particularly in a state where that status quo, which is most of you, has a lot of money, will never be an easy thing to do. And this is not for the faint of heart. And you need to be prepared whether you are amending a law, creating one for the first time, or just tweaking one around the edges. You need to be prepared to get sued. Now, there's no industry in America that does not have a team of attorneys waiting to defend or advocate for the legal pieces necessary to make sure something gets sustained. Look at patent attorneys and all around. Look at the whole issue of tort reform, why we can't get it. Look at our healthcare mess. And when it comes to education, all you have to do is take a walk down the block up 2 blocks to 16th Street, the NEA headquarters, and I can tell you there's not one, there's not two. They have 3 floors of in-house attorneys, as well as about 5 law firms on their staffs. Your school boards associations have attorneys. All of the organized labor movements in this country have attorneys. And yet we, great advocates of charter schools, develop great laws. They get passed, we get sued, and we go, as they did in Florida, should we appeal the ruling on the Florida Schools of Excellence Commission, the independent authorizer, rather than just let it die? And the actual fact that, and I'm using you all in Florida as a guinea pig example, I see Ed Pasquale in the background smiling at me, because frankly, Georgia's being sued now. Colorado was schooled over its state commission. Michigan was sued for constitutionality 3 times in New Jersey. I could go on about the states have been sued, lived to tell about it, and fixed it, and have never been sued again. But the minute you put down pen to paper, the minute you vote for a bill, the minute you even engage in starting a charter school, you need to knock on the door of the people in charge and say, are we prepared not just to write the best law, but to defend it, and those who don't defend it, frankly, to hold them accountable. So if we're doing something right, we should be fighting in court. If we're doing something wrong, we should all be really, really comfortable about what's going on. So with that, let me just turn to our panel. First, we're going to have Susan Schleffler, dynamic president of Kip Key Charter School in Washington, D.C., one of a family of phenomenal charter schools, not just here in the city, but around the country. And Susan's going to give us a little perspective on the local trends with heavy emphasis on some of the challenges you faced from sort of that inadvertent policy making. Susan.
Thanks, Jeanne. So just to back up a little bit, so, I did Teach for America in 1992, and can you all hear me? Is that good? And so that was a while ago, and I was really excited as a classroom teacher, as many new teachers are, to get into education. They're enthusiastic. They want to do safety patrols and student council and girls clubs and boys clubs. And I was in public education in the classroom for 9 years. I did my Teach for America commitment in Baltimore, stayed on, and then moved to D.C. and worked in D.C. public schools. And what was so frustrating to me as a classroom teacher was that the system was so dysfunctional and it incentivized the wrong behavior. And I tried for many years to change that from the classroom, change that from where I was sitting up to the administration, to the city council, and all the way up to the Department of Ed with very little success. And to give you an example of what that might look like, I decided I wanted to extend my school day because I realized that I was not accomplishing not even my job description by the end of the day at 3:15 when the kids were dismissed. And I extended my school day till 4:30 for my class. Oh my goodness. You would have thought that something was going on in my room that was, endangering the lives of children. The reaction that got. My principal at first was like, "Oh, that's great. I love new teachers. Look at that enthusiasm. Go get it. That's awesome. You do that." And that quickly turned to, any chance we can open this up to all the 6th grade students. And I even offered, I said, not only will I keep my kids late, but I'll keep the other teacher's kids late who doesn't want to stay late because I know that I need to do this. And eventually I was told, that's it, don't do it. And I just got to a point where I was like, this is so dysfunctional that we know what we need to do to make progress, and yet we're in a system that is not allowing it, because what I was doing was offering my kids more than what the kids next door or the classroom over. It wasn't equitable. And I understand that. And reality is everybody's game should have gotten, everybody should have improved, rather than holding me back and saying that, it's a problem. And it was a problem to the point that I was like, okay, I cannot do this from inside the classroom. And I realized at that point that I need to step outside of the system, create a model, work with people who have a whatever it takes attitude to create a school system that supports teachers in doing what they know needs to get done. We know how to solve this problem. It's inconvenient to the adults for the most part, but we do know how to solve the problem of the gaps that we have in education. So that's when I sort of hooked up with KIPP, and I was in the original group of KIPP, which was it's a charter school that started in Houston, Texas, and then went to the Bronx and was high performing. Don Fisher of GAP got behind it, gave lots of money to say, if this works, why are we not doing this everywhere? Unfortunately, we couldn't open up KIPP schools as fast as we opened up GAPs. And that became a realization very quickly from Don's plans of having 100 schools that first year. We opened 3. So one of which was mine in Washington, D.C. in 2001. We started with just 80 students, and we now have over 1,500 students at 7 schools, and we will continue to grow up until we have 10 schools here in Washington. And we had over 6,000 resumes this year of teachers that want to work in this environment. Our school days are 8 to 5, so we have an extended day, and we have an extended week. We have Saturday school from 9 to 1 and an extended year, and that's what it takes. So I think. I was supposed to share sort of a war story, if you will, about policy and how things don't seem to look like they do when you guys are up here, and then what we're doing down here, and we're trying to figure out what are y'all doing. Well, what I would say is an example of it's a big issue in alignment. What the State Department's doing versus what the Department of Ed, what's going on at the state level, and then what's going on at the local level. So I in 2001 opened up Key Academy, the highest performing public middle school in Washington, D.C., and we received startup funding from Title V-B, and it was fabulous. It's exactly what we needed for planning and implementation of a new charter school. We've opened up 6 schools since and have been denied that funding for every school after that. And that's about $3 million worth of funding that the Department of Ed did intend for us to get. And we even went to the Department of Ed and said, we're not getting it. And we need help with getting our Title V-B funding because it's really difficult and it's a major burden on us to get this startup funding. And they even went and reissued guidance on the language to the state level. And then the state level, Aussie, who actually works really well for KIPP here in DC, said, hey, we want to make this work too, but we have a problem with the local level and the language, and they're defining charter differently. And so all this is said to say that we never got the money, and we still haven't received the money, and I still need to open up 3 more schools in order to fill sort of my game plan. And so that is just an example of the alignment issues that we're having. I would say all the parties involved wanted the money to get to KIPP, and yet we still are struggling with actually accessing that money. A similar problem is with our extended day. I mean, our kids are in school over 40% more than the traditional school system, and we receive no additional funding for that. I'm thrilled to hear President Obama and Secretary Duncan preach about extended time. Yes, this is going to take a little bit more time than the 6 hours we have. We know it's going to take more. We know what the solutions are. And we need the funding to back what we know works. And so we would like to see that funding. They have an act, the Time Act that's out right now, and we need people to get behind that so that schools that are offering extended day can afford to continue to do so. And those are just 2 sort of war stories, Jeanne, that have sort of hit us hard financially and and have been for the since inception. We have been unable to access, and there are programs that are encouraging extended day, but it's the language around it. It'll be after-school programming opening to the community. And so we can't get 21st century funding because we're not an after-school program, we're an extended day. So it's just that language and the semantics around things that are really problematic, and it's not getting the money to the folks that I really believe it was intended for.
Thank you, Susan. And John, as we turn to you, Representative John Legg, Pasco County, Florida, also the founder of Dayspring Academy Charter School, and the chairman of the Pre-K Policy Committee in Florida. John was instrumental in making changes in the state's charter law over the last couple of years. But as you talk about your challenges in Florida and some of the opportunities, if you wouldn't mind also including and addressing this issue that Susan raised, which I think is fascinating. Susan is one of probably 25 different quote-unquote DC's not a state leaders we've heard from around the country that say federal money goes to the state's supposed to release it. They go back and forth, as you said. Is it a question of alignment, John? I mean, state education departments, I don't care what state you're in and how great your governor is, your state board members, there is something that happens that these folks just don't get how to write a check. And we see this over and over again, and lest you be a legislator that literally picks up the phone and breaks that logjam, it doesn't happen. So how do we cope with that, and have you seen that, and talk to us about the state perspective?
Sure. Let me begin by just talking about a little bit about a state perspective, especially for those of you that are in a governor's office or potential state legislators. I think you want to step back and really look at the broad view. For those of us that sit on a committee and we kind of look at the big picture items. And when you look at charter schools, what are really the big picture items that most state legislators want to see? Why should we do something different? Why should we do something different? Well, the first obviously answer is because what we're doing right now doesn't seem to be working. But let me give you 4 key points of why charter schools have started and kind of talk about each point and why they're being kind of slowly taken out from underneath them. The very first point of why most charter schools are being funded is basically to provide innovation. What the idea in Florida is let's let charter schools, we hear from districts, we hear from superintendents saying, free us up from this governmental regulation. If you kind of cut these strings back, these mandates, and let us just teach, you'll be amazed at what we can do. So what we said in the state legislature in Florida back in 1996, I believe it was, is let's do that with charter schools. So we set up a system of innovation where schools can be flexible, do teacher quality. We don't have unions in charter schools, or in most of them. So they're at-will employees. Other things we can do is flexibility, do pay incentives. Let the teachers develop the curriculum. Let the parents basically drive the needs of the school with the students. So the first key point is innovation. I'll get back to that in a second. The second point is as a state, we want to target the most at-risk students in the state. The low-income students, the students that have not been performing, and close the achievement gaps. The third point that as a state legislature, we all have shrinking budgets, is we want to make sure that our dollars are effective. We want it done cheaper. The fourth point is we want to see outputs. We want to make sure that these students are learning. Let's go back to some of the points I talked about, what's happening in Florida, and I believe in any state. And if you're a state legislator and you're looking at doing charter schools, I would encourage you to be on guard for this. Let's talk about about innovation. And this is what I sometimes scratch my head. Charter schools have now been going on 11, 12 years in Florida, and we've had a charter school now for 10 years and been operating it. And it's funny, when we first started out, the districts were sitting there saying, great, you've got great test results. Matter of fact, when we first opened up our school, we thought we were the first school in our county. We planned for only 60 kids. We opened up with 120. We thought, oh, it's pretty unique. The next year, we were still the only charter school. The next year, we had over 1,000 students apply to get into the school. What that showed us is there is a need. We didn't do no market analysis, but the analysis of the parents said, we want something different for our students. But what we've seen is kind of a change. And what has happened? I call it regulation overload, duplicative regulation. Charter schools will not die because the state legislature comes in and says, we are no longer going to do charter schools. What they're going to do is they're going to clogs the arteries with regulations. What you hear districts and authorizers saying is, we don't like the way you're hiring teachers. We don't like the way you're budgeting your finances. We don't like your certification process. We don't like the way you're reporting your curriculum. We don't like this. Do these reports, these reports, these reports, these reports. So what happens is basically by a slow process of time, your charter school that was once flexible is no longer a charter school that's flexible, but simply a mini district school that's operated under a different name with the guise of school choice. And what we've seen in Florida drastically over the last, I would say, 3 years is no longer charter schools, but mini public schools under the arm of the school districts. Because what's happened is they regulate based upon the most egregious act that has happened. And I'm sure John will attest, there are some egregious acts that would happen with charter schools. One of the things that happened, which is a sad commentary, but yet I think it's a very good commentary, and I was talking to our school choice office, about 178 charter schools have closed down in Florida over the last 5 years. Basically, 20% of the charter schools in Florida have failed, 1 out of 5. Now, if you would take that standard for that school that failed, financial reasons, academic reasons, health, safety, and welfare reasons, and apply that to public schools, I guarantee you 1 out of 5 would fail. But guess what? They're still open. They're still opening, and they're still open, and they're still teaching our kids, and they're still teaching them a low-quality service at a high price, and they're still failing, and that achievement gap is growing. So that idea of being flexible, you have to be on guard with. Second issue is it cheaper? Well, charter schools in Florida and in my part of the state basically get about 70 cents on the dollar of public schools. That's incredible. But yet, our teachers get paid more. Our teachers get paid more. Our students have more textbooks. Our students basically have the more of the necessity in classroom items than their public school peers, but yet it's 30% cheaper. What's going on there? Now, let me add something to that. On top of that 30% that is cheaper, about 70%, the districts in our state, and depending on how you write your laws in your state, they still are allowed to keep 5% of the funds based upon the money that flows through your school. There's legitimate reasons why they may need those funds. I mean, I'm not arguing that point, but the point being is charter schools do provide high-quality service at a cheaper rate. And let me talk briefly about one other point, and that's the outputs. What you see districts doing, and I understand why they're doing it, or authorizers, because it depends on how you set it up in your state, is you look at when they authorize it, they are heavy loaded on the inputs. But quite honestly, I don't care about inputs, I care about outputs. And if you look at any state legislator and you talk to them, and if you were a state legislator, I'm sure you say this to yourself, you're not so concerned about how great that contract looks and how great it looks on paper. What you're concerned about at the end of the day are those students learning, and are those dollars being accounted for in a transparent and an accountable way. If those two measures are met, the inputs really aren't as important as the outputs. Now, I'm not saying you don't need high-quality charters when you write it, but what you want to make sure is that when you regulate charter schools, that you don't regulate them on the front end. You regulate them on the back end and seeing what they produce. A couple of war stories I was asked to kind of talk about from a legislative point of view. I don't want to talk about 3 little areas that you want to just watch out for if you write charter school laws. One, make sure you look at multiple authorizers. You don't want a single authorizer in your state, especially if it's the person that's regulating your charter school. Because basically the person that's governing you is your greatest competition. They talk about being partners, and I believe they have well intentions. And I got permission to use this analogy, and you'll see why. They talk about being a partner. How is it it's like a marriage? How is it in a partner when they tell you what to do, they tell you everything you can spend, and they have the ability to shut you down? And I sat back and says, well, it does sound like a marriage sometimes. But the point being is it's not a true partnership. It's a upper person and a lower person. A true partnership is a relationship back and forth amongst equals. And you can't have an equal relationship when the person that is funding you is also regulating you and at the same time is your competition for quality. Because the bottom line, when it's at the end of the day, if you succeed, what does that mean? It meant the district was not able to perform well where you succeeded. And no matter how many times you slice it, that's a difficult thing to swallow. And it's not a good thing or a bad thing, it's just a reality. The next thing that you have to watch out for, and this is a problem that we're running to in Florida, is facilities. Charter schools do not have the facilities that traditional public schools have. That's, at least in Florida, they don't. It's a very difficult process. The funding is less than a third of what should be used for a regular school facility dollars, but yet parents are on long waiting lists to get their kids into those schools. The last point, and I mentioned it earlier, is you got to watch out for duplicative regulations. Kind of a funny story that we run into quite a bit. We're required, or we've been doing it for about 10 years now, doing monthly reports to our district, showing them how we spend our money, what our test scores are every month. And I'm not embellishing by saying the monthly reports are about that thick. Now, the irony of it all, I don't know if it's really irony or what, but what's so funny about it is that those exact reports are on their computer system that they require us to use. But we will get cited and potentially shut down if we're more than 7 days late. So we have to do a report that they already have, that we have to spend tons of hours to do, that they already have in their system, but we're constantly doing it. The other kind of unique war story is we're one of the few schools in Florida that does the merit award program. There's one big district that does it, actually 4 counties that do it, but not many districts have bought into it. We are one of the only schools that do it in our county. And this month, the state law says that the awards have to be paid out by October 1st. So a week before that we were supposed to pay them out, the district is asking us how we spent them, give us a report on where we spent it, who we spent it to, give us a full accounting of all the dollars. And we politely told them, well, we haven't spent it yet. It's not supposed to be spent till next week. They look back and says, we don't care. We just need it now. So you're caught into that regulation of they want something, but yet it's impossible for you to produce it. And you have to remember, and John's a corporation, and we're more of I like to use the word community-based because it's all community leaders that run the school. The issue with community schools is that it's not a corporation, it's a principal that's working with their administrators at a small school environment because they are the heartbeat of the school. They provide all this administrative oversight, yet they jump at a dime when it comes to the regulators. So if you're writing laws, please remember these 3 facts. Multiple authorizers are key. And if you can't do multiple authorizers, please make sure you have an appeals process. Make sure you have proper facility funding. And third, make sure you find a way to reduce the duplicate regulations. Because I'm not saying regulations aren't important. You just got to make sure that they don't basically clog the arteries and make charter schools have a heart attack in your state.
Thank you, Representative Legg. Just another transitional comment before we get to the national piece. So 2 things. There's an old saying, to whom much is given, much is expected. And the reason I started picking on Florida to begin with is because they have great state board members, great legislators who even actually understand and can explain what charter schools are, which is really great because it's very hard when legislators have a million things to do, but you help operate charter schools, you've been involved in it, and therefore we think they should have the greatest law in the country. So that's number 1. Number 2, I would also just add that basically the thread through your comments, which I think goes back to what Susan was saying, was equity. Whether it's equity in the federal delivery of funds, whether it's equity in facilities, whether it's equity in terms of being able to have a fair shot at opening a charter school outside of a school board. These are key considerations that you cannot afford to return to another time for an amendment. It's much, much harder. And so I just think that's really, really critical, some of your advice, both of you, about these issues. It's amazing how much they have to fight on their own once that law is signed and gone. So John Hage, you're the CEO of Charter Schools USA. You operate at least 20-something.
28.
Thank you, schools in the state of Florida. Looking elsewhere, have been involved in some of the state policy battles, certainly locally. You were a policy dweeb once upon a time, before Governor Bush was Governor Bush.
Still am at heart.
Still are at heart.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about what you've seen as the issues. I did not name the session War Stories, by the way, but do tell us what you think are the most, maybe some of the greatest threats nationally as you've stood back from Florida
Sure.
and taken a look at this movement.
Absolutely, and thanks for being here. I appreciate what John was saying because he plays the other side of the coin, which is he has to deal with the legislative component, but he also operates a school, and I think part of the strategy would be to have every legislator to run a charter school, and then I think we would have no more issues. So I'm just putting that out there as an idea. So if you want to see me afterwards, we'll be happy to sign you up and get you the documents to do so. Jeanne, first I just want to say, having Jeanne run this panel is very important because there's really two approaches to charters in this country. One is that you sort of take the status quo approach, which is that if you're different than the school system and you can, and you take kids that they don't want, you might get a charter in a storefront with 50 kids, and you hopefully will be successful 10 years later in making those kids academically proficient. And that's sort of been the model that it seems that the NEA and others are coming out with lately to be, that they're actually saying, after you've read the paper recently, we're sort of for this idea now. Now that we have a Democratic administration that's for this, we're finding that it's maybe better to join them than fight them. The other model really is the approach that I think Jeanne and the Center for Education Reform and legislators, KIPP Academy, folks in the field or at legislative levels are really focused on, and that is fundamental reform, competitive reform. It's not just enough to say that we're focused on students that the school district doesn't want to educate, quite frankly, or students that have dropped out, or sort of on the fringe of their focus, but really focusing on systematic reform. In other words, taking on the system because competition in and of itself is acceptable. It is a good thing. It creates more higher performance incentives for other schools to perform better. And I often go back and I say, what is the purpose of charter schools? And John went through those, and I think of each one of those that have been put into the law. And it's funny how innovation, right? He mentioned innovation, has become, in some ways, almost a way to say, we'll only give you schools that don't compete with us. And recently we're applying for schools in Georgia. And Georgia has a very good law, and it's getting stronger. They have their own new commission, which will help provide another route for authorizing outside of the school district. If they turn you down, you can go through this commission. Of course, all 6 schools that we applied for in Georgia were turned down, along with 100 other applicants across the state, because they see more and more the application of charter schools being a threat. They don't see it necessarily for what it should be, which is that it's a competitive opportunity for them to do a better job to ensure that if parents are given that choice, they in fact continue to choose their public schools, those traditional public school routes. And so I find that the word innovation has become a little bit unique. It often means that what are you doing differently than what we're doing? And so when you go through the process, all of a sudden you show them that you're doing data analysis this way, and you're tracking individual education plans, and you're focused on outcomes, and you're creating innovative learning environments, and you're focused on merit pay and how you pay teachers for performance. All these things we do in our schools, and interestingly enough, that's not considered innovative. And you say to yourself, well, how could that not be innovative? Well, of course it's innovative because it's creating higher performing outcomes. It's creating students on a level that are academically proficient that were not before. Otherwise, those parents would not have chosen that school, and the data would not support that. In fact, what we have found recently is we've been tracking our own data, and I know that there's other organizations in the state that do this in Florida where we operate. And what we're finding more and more is that as we keep those students in our schools longer, they do better every single year, to the point where even though our schools are more diverse than the state as a whole, we're actually seeing higher outcomes on the FCAT scores and on the testing. And these results are very encouraging for us because at the end of the day, it's very hard to argue with data. It's very hard for policymakers who really have, maybe a different idea of what they want. For a superintendent who actually tells you, yeah, we love charter schools, come on in. And then once you're there, you kind of get the hug with a stab in the back, and you notice that when you're walking away, there's a knife in your back. And a little war story recently. So not to pick on Georgia, but to pick on Georgia. We were up there, and one of the superintendents was actually from the county where we opened our very first school 12 years ago. And that superintendent knows that the schools that at that point that he authorized are today some of the highest performing schools in his entire county and in fact in the state of Florida. And he had great things to say about us in the press. In fact, he was like, this is the kind of organization we'd love to have come in our county. And yes, our residents want charter schools. And so we felt like we were given the welcome mat. So working through the nonprofit board in the district, in the state, we came in and we applied on their behalf for a new charter school. And we got parents to show up at meetings. We went out and talked to the paper. We found a site. We put everything together. And then we found that as the application went in, that it quite didn't meet what their expectations were. For they didn't really want us to open a school in this area, but only down here. And really not for that many kids, only for this many kids. And oh, by the way, don't actually put all this into those schools because we already do that stuff, so you're not innovative if you're doing what we're doing. And before you knew it, they were taking away all of the innovation and the processes and the systems that we had found and used to be successful. And then we thought, well, they'll still approve us. Well, no, not at all. In fact, the denial came out with 15 pages of detailed reasons why we were not approved in his school district. And one of the most interesting one of those was that apparently we had not shown sufficient experience in the past in running successful charter schools. And I kind of thought that was always interesting. Some other war stories, let me kind of point out a couple threats. And this is really important. The charter school movement today, having been involved in this for 15 years, and in fact, I used to work for Jeb and his foundation before he became governor, worked with Mr. Fair and Mr. Bush in the first charter school in Florida, fell in love with this from a public policy perspective. Came into this from an idea and sort of thought, how do you implement ideas? And I'm, more about the do tank kind of thing versus the think tank idea. How do you actually implement the thinking? And so I fell in love with the concept early on. Started a nonprofit first and consulted in helping getting schools started. Before I knew it, I realized that the only way we could actually make this work for us was through a for-profit model. And we're unabashedly for-profit. In fact, I would make the case that there's advantages to that model because it creates efficiencies. It requires very clear alignment between outcomes for students and the outcomes financially that you are earning from a fee in running a high-performing school. And I know there's a lot of debate about that, and I think it's something we should talk about. And one of the things that I see that is a threat is that there is a purposeful division between nonprofit and for-profits where the operator's tax status is made an issue rather than the school's performance. It creates a false issue that stymies investors and entrepreneurs from creating school opportunities in the most neediest of communities. Another great threat that we're seeing emerging today in the charter school world is that there's a continued funding inequity that's almost become acceptable. It's okay for us. It's almost like we've lived so long in the back of the bus that it's okay to accept less money. But it isn't okay. It's a fundamental right of those public school students, of those parents, to have the same amount of funding as other public school students and traditional schools. And it's a battle that we're beginning to win in some school districts and in some states, but not across the board today. Another fundamental threat to the charter school movement is the idea that today's budget crisis, is somehow an excuse to slow down authorizing. That somehow, because states are contracting and we're having to find ways to cut back, that charter school growth therefore must take its hit too. Forgetting the fact that we're already sitting at 65 to 70 cents on the dollar, already performing above standard in many cases, and taking money from existing school districts and traditional public schools is that argument that they use. But they don't talk about the fact that those students also, the cost is reduced at those school districts. We now take on the cost of educating that child. We assist that district in building facilities that they would otherwise have to put on their budgets that we're now building on our budgets. Another thing that really concerns me is the regulatory reloading. There tends to be a lot of bills that go through legislatures that are sort of positioned as the idea of let's just put a little more accountability in. And regulation and accountability sort of have this really, ugly relationship because you can wrap it up and call it accountability, but if the true intent is to tie the hands of operators to be innovative, to create innovative ways how teachers learn, to give them money when they operate schools longer school days, this really contracts the incentive. It really reduces the opportunity for charter schools to get innovative outcomes and to perform better. And a lot of that's happening today. Another couple quick points are, there's a seems to be this sort of unique idea that unions, if you can't beat them, join them attitude. And most charter schools today are not unionized. And I'm unabashedly will tell you that I think that's a good idea. That's a good thing. It's not a bad thing, because those teachers don't want to unionize. They have the right to do that. They have the right to do that under federal law, and they choose not to most of the time because they feel that they are aligned with management, that there is a consistent view of the vision. They have empowerment. They are a part of the program, and teachers are in fact doing what they love and what they were about when they were going through college. They had that whole concept of getting the kids in the classroom and teaching them, and then they kind of got into a system where it was about numbers, and now they're back to teaching in an environment where they can do that without the union pressures. And lastly, innovative charters, authorizers as competitors. I'll just join John's point in that. They're in competition with each other. At the end of the day, if you're an authorizer and you are looking at budget constraints and you want to keep every kid you have, is it in your interest or not to authorize a charter school? And if once you get that school authorized, even if you win the battle, you're going to have an ongoing battle of ensuring that you get all the funds, that you get treated in a fair way. And so I would argue that there's a growth for, and there's a need for third-party authorizers, non-district authorizers to ensure and to keep them fair.
Great. Thank you, John. So the whole issue of federal policy and the big race to the top drive, I want to throw out for a second. Secretary Duncan made clear at the National Charter School Conference that not only were caps an issue, and of course that's been part of the hue and cry coming from the department, caps on the number of schools, caps potentially on the number of kids allowed to go, places that have regional limitations, so North Carolina would be penalized and Oklahoma might be penalized, but also in answer to a question about Rhode Island, he made it clear that states really should not mess around with keeping money from kids and equity. How do we make sure that translates down to the local level? Will that message get through, John Legg, to state legislators, or will they make the mistake and then be wondering why they didn't cash in?
Sure. I'm glad you asked that question, because that's kind of the issue that Florida is going through right now. Everyone says Florida is kind of in the pole position of this race to the top money, and it's ours to lose on a lot of issues. And I see one area that we could definitely trip up, and it's dealing with charter schools, because we may have this false assumption that we've been doing it so long that we're obviously doing it correctly. And I would venture to say that we've probably stepped backwards over the last several years in charter schools. Our Speaker of the House a couple years ago, and I'm sing President Obama's praises here as a Republican, which is very rare for me to do. But our Speaker of the House said several years ago that right now there's a child being born somewhere, and that mother's looking at that child for the first time, and she doesn't care whether she's going to a public school, a charter school, or a private school. She just wants him to go to a quality school. And what I think is happening is the President and Secretary of Education is seeing that constituency that has been so long disenfranchised by the traditional public school and is making it a priority for public education to fund charter schools because it's an avenue. The President is very shrewd in this, because it took a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, to reform welfare. It took a Republican president, Richard Nixon, to warm relations with communist China. And it may take a Democrat president to break the back of the public school unions and the public school establishment to allow charter schools to finally meet the needs of the most disenfranchised students in the U.S. And it has the state legislatures going into this session. I believe, from the rhetoric that I'm hearing out of Washington or here and at the White House, is that charter schools are meeting the needs of those students that have been the most disenfranchised. And if states don't make sure that it's a priority in their race to the top, they will be at a competitive disadvantage. So it is Florida's race to lose, and I hope we don't lose it and we get some of that funding.
And the other piece, that's very true, John, and the other piece that, of course, is a huge concern for people in this room, for people around the country, for people certainly in the administration, is quality. And we talk a lot about quality, and there's different definitions. But Susan, I was struck by our continuing discussion here in D.C., where the charter schools are literally the highest performing public schools, with the exception of a few, and yet you don't make AYP. So what's that about?
It's a little bit of a disaster. I would say until we have some national standards and a national assessment, AYP is relatively useless. I mean, I think under, and I have the opportunity to look at what other KIPP schools are doing in other states to be able to compare how is KIPP DC performing against KIPPs in Houston and in New York. And the reality is because we can all, at the state level, we set our own state accountability plans with our own assessments and then the targets that we have to meet. You're comparing. You just can't compare. You can't. There's no comparison. You can't say if you're taking the DC CAS and in Texas they're taking the TOS and you guys are taking the FCAT or whatever you guys are taking. At the end of the day, the rigor on one test is very different than the basic skills test in another state. And then you put some really serious consequences to not making AYP. So 99% of our 8th graders this year, which is our exiting grade of our middle school, were proficient in math. And compared to the local schools in the areas that we're serving are around like 20, if that. And so the reality is we're extremely high performing, but the regulations are not consistent from state to state, so it's relatively useless. I think another example might be, a subgroup category. So in DC, if you have special needs students and you trigger the AYP cutoff if you have 25 special needs kids in your school. That means that every kid that is special needs has to make the proficiency cutoff. In another KIPP school, the number could be as high as 50 in the school. So we're all being held to different targets and taking different assessments. And until we have national standards with a national assessment, it's very hard to get behind AYP and more importantly the consequences behind it. It needs a major overhaul.
So, John, I bet you're scared of the idea of national standards for charters, but if not, you don't have to even comment on that. What's your prescription for how you get around this data conundrum, if you will, and how to make sure charters are quality?
Well, I think that part of the challenge is to understand the involvement of what's happened within the charter world itself. So, for example, the early growth in charters was what we would not call in a derisive way the mom and pop movement. As time went on, just like in any market, you start to understand what is working, what is not, and scale begins to become important, not just for efficient reasons, for the financial outcomes, to ensure that overhead is kept low, but also that academically what is working in one school can be transferred to other schools. So when you see, for example, the KIPP network grow across the United States, or you see the Charter School USA network begin to grow in the Southeast and beyond, you start to understand that it's not because there were existing, models of, there are different standards in different states. There are different ways of measurement, and obviously within schools you have the variety of the student issues too that you're dealing with. But what we found is that when you can begin to build a system that is actually, multi-state, which districts don't have to work against. They're not working with that issue of what happens when Georgia drives academic measurement different than Florida does, or that North Carolina looks at it different than Idaho. So what we're kind of a bit agnostic on this idea of national standards. I think we think that the best way to develop any consensus is from the ground floor up. So if there is going to be some level of national standard, which I could see some advantages of it, and I can see also the challenges and disadvantages of it, that it really needs to take place in a way similar to the involvement of the charter movement itself, which is that when you have operators operating in dozens of states, already dealing with comparative analysis between student performance in those states, and then trying to compare themselves with other operators, which we're doing more and more as an evolving industry, you start to understand that it really is tough to do that because there are no exact measurements. At the same time, That's because traditionally education has been such a locally controlled enterprise. And there's got to be a balance between that local control, but also those national measurements that can start to be outlined by the folks in the field. So I think as operators, not just in the charter school world, but in the traditional public school system, start to compare and contrast their data across the U.S., you'll start to see an emergence, which we're already seeing, obviously, in the political debate today. And I know the department's working on some of those measurements now.
All right. Questions? Open it up to the floor. Representative Setzler.
Thank you.
Can you say who you are, too, for the rest
Ed
of the
Setzler from Georgia. I have the privilege of chairing the Charter School Subcommittee on House Education and have worked with Jeanne for years, and I appreciate your involvement in Georgia. I'm concerned with the focus of the federal government and the president taking an interest in charters. There's sort of exuberance that charters are going to, there's going to be this new birth of charter schools that's going to solve our problems. My concern is, though, that if state laws aren't written properly, we're not going to have the kind of impact that we know we can have. And I wanted to ask you and John particularly, and to put this in perspective, I want to say in 2007 in Georgia, there were 27 charter schools applied for, and 26 of those 27 charters were denied. I don't know if that was one of your schools, John.
Yes, sir.
But 26 of those 27 charter school applications were denied in Georgia because in 2007 it was only the school boards that had schools against which those charter schools were going to compete that could approve those charter schools. Mm-hmm. The one that was approved was actually requested by the school board. So taking that off the table, 26 of 26 were denied in Georgia. And that just gives you kind of a numerical picture of the landscape without an alternate authorizer or a multiple authorizer framework, which Jeanne's organization has been very strong at pushing for. Could you or John speak to the importance of an alternate authorizer or a multiple authorizer component to your charter school law to really make charter schools viable? Because if they're only approved by school districts, they will, again, be approved only by those folks against which they will compete. And frankly, there's not going to be the kind of marketplace and the kind of competition that charter schools really should represent.
Well, let me take a stab, and then, John, I'm sure you have something to add. And Representative Setzler is absolutely right and had helped lead the charge to get the right law passed that could address that. And studying states with independent authorizers, multiple authorizers, whatever you call them, has taught us several things. First of all, that great schools, we talk about high-performing quality, we like to say great schools, great charter schools owe their existence to great laws. Okay charter laws have okay schools for the most part. Sure, there are exceptions. Lousy charter school laws pretty much have non-existent charter schools or charter schools that are charter schools in name only. I am concerned, as much as there is this enormous, and we have been among the first there, as well as being critical since, to say this enormous support and recognition of, wow, the Obama administration is so strong on this issue. It's almost as if the debate on charter schools are over. We can go home, pack it up, everyone's on board. I will tell you, we were even shocked to get a call from, there was a producer for the conservative Laura Ingraham show shopping for a charter school operator to come on, and the producer says to me on the phone, we were going to get the head of the union, but now they're all for charter schools. There's no controversy. I said, you're with the Laura Ingraham show. You, of all people, should be skeptical of the unions. It's not like I was talking to somebody in mainstream media. I was absolutely shocked. Someone yesterday made some comment here. I have been with people who I really thought understood this. Not only are they not playing by the same rules, they may be just paying a lot of lip service, and I think, in fact, there's some also interesting dialogue going on to oppose race to the top just so they can come back and get what they want in NCLB, but that's for another day. The bottom line is there has never been more fights before at the state level. And the administration recognizes some really good things, as people like my colleague Nelson Smith will tell you from the National Alliance about charter schools, but they are ignoring the rest of the factors that make for effective charter school laws, which are the authorizer, which is equity in all forms, operational and facilities-wise, and frankly, independence and operational autonomy. So when you see some of the troubled schools, and you see some of the problems, and you see some of the struggles, and frankly, when you see people not stepping up to open the kinds of schools that can indeed be part of that landscape for reform, it's because it comes down to law. It is worth fighting for. But you know, it's like really complicated, and it's not a sound bite, and it takes you, I mean, Ed went to school, we had arguments about it, you have to fight with your colleagues and your friends about it. It's not fun, but there's certainly models, and I think we've learned a tremendous amount. And our race for the top for charter schools, even though I'm not on this panel technically, really does lay this out, and we're actually re-evaluating rankings again, and in a couple of weeks we're going to be releasing the next ranking, and people are going to take a nosedive because of what they've done or not done with their law. John, anything?
I think this
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, and going to the issue of multiple authorizers, if you would have asked me personally, would I go to a different authorizer than our current district at our district? I would say no, because I'm a firm believer in that I like the devil you know versus the devil you don't know, and I'm in state government, so it's one of those issues that it depends on where you are. Not all districts are bad authorizers. I mean, there are some very high quality authorizers in Florida. There's also some really, really, really poor ones. Going to the issue of the race to the top, top issue, to steal from Reagan, who stole from the Russians. Trust but verify. Great. I love what they're saying. Let's see what happens. Let's verify it. And that trust but verify attitude really should be both from an authorizer to the charter school, and also from the charter school to the authorizer, because the authorizer shouldn't just trust a charter school, so he should verify quality outputs, financial accountability. On the flip side, the charter schools need to verify that the authorizer or the sponsor is doing their job, because I'll tell you, we've had case in some high-profile newspaper articles in our county where the district, who I feel is fairly competent and have a good relationship, basically said, no, you don't get the money, you don't qualify. It's not always politically correct to tell the chairman of education who wrote the law that they know that you get the money, that no, you don't qualify, because we simply called them up and says, you better check the statute about 4 more times. And about 6 months later, they says, oh, we're so sorry, you were right to begin with. And that took a lot of political clout saying, hey, why aren't you guys double checking your laws? And I don't think it was they had malice intent, but it's the reality that we work in. So when it goes back to the federal government, let's see what happens. I like what they're saying, but let's see if it actually translates to quality charter schools that are well funded.
And while we're on the subject of lawsuits and authorizers and lawsuits, and Georgia's going through a lawsuit right now against its commission. So John Hage, be the skunk of the garden party. Why didn't your state appeal?
I picked on Georgia enough already.
Why didn't your state appeal the unconstitutionality of the FSE?
This is the earlier issue you brought up, which is that let's just call it for what it is. There's very good intent when it comes to being a part of something that now has momentum, i.e. charter schools. It's kind of like if you're not for charter schools, you're not cool. The unfortunate part with that is that most people that say they are for charter schools recently don't necessarily know what that means. So when it comes to the battles of actually on the ground getting in place new authorizing bodies like the Schools of Excellence in Florida, or seeing the Georgia authorizing new body, the commission there, win a legislative battle, but now a legal battle, it requires a new set of to really stand up and stick with that battle. And that really is the problem, is that when the agencies with their bureaucratic systems, and most of those people are not politically appointed, they're really in a place where they are dealing with 95% of their constituency being traditional public schools. And when it comes to the prioritization of resources, John, we've seen this. The truth is that charters just don't even get in the top, 50%, much less in the top 10% of issues that they're going to fight for. So when it comes to getting legal counsels, racked up, and that includes attorney general offices, that includes the governor's office, all the way through, you must have a consistent alignment politically. And it brings up another point, and that is, charter schools, are not a fad. This is a movement that is now established 20 years in the making, and you have over 1 million students in America and growing at a phenomenal rate with outcomes that are, yes, varied, and many are not performing to standard, but you have a model of true reform where you are getting exceptional outcomes and true competition into the marketplace. Okay, it goes back to the luncheon speaker, and it's doing that in a way where it's no longer the genie can't be put back into the bottle. So in these kind of battles, charter proponents, operators, have to become more sophisticated. We have to be prepared to get the big law firms on the case. We have to be prepared to build associations. We have to be prepared to go in and have the lobbying teams to speak right directly at the governor's level, at the legislative level. Walk in and demand that you are treated fairly and that you are given a seat at the table. When it comes to these race to the top dollars, I mean, we're scared to death that at the end of the day, after all the lip service is said and done, that when the table is set, there will only be enough chairs for the status quo, sort of the monopoly. I hate to call it that, with the blob, as Jeanne calls it. Those folks will be there because that's who's been disseminating those grants for the last 100 years. The question is, how do we ensure we're at the table? You've got to scrap and you've got to fight. And I got to tell you, that's why the charter school movement is winning today, is at the end of the day, it has scrapped and fought and put itself at the table through effort, and effort alone will get us there.
Questions? Did you? Front row? Oh, I'm sorry.
Pay.
Front row, back, and I think.
Okay. Pay Emilsson from Sweden. Let me ask you one question. I have observed many sessions now, and coming from old socialistic Sweden to the market economy, freedom, innovation, economic growth. Why do you make this so bloody complicated?
So right.
And I just can't understand it. And then just one piece of information when it comes to the Swedish change. I think we got about 900 schools when we went into the voucher system. The driving force for change are for profit schools. No others, because profit schools, then you scale it up, you build up change. You don't do that with a school somewhere. And that's I can't understand either. I can understand we have the discussion in Sweden, but why isn't that obvious in a country like United States that you are using profit motive in education? Please, why?
I'm going to say 2 or 3 things about that. First of all, there's actually a federal ban on any money going directly to any school that's for-profit. The way the federal government defines a public school, it's nonprofit is in actually the definition. So there's not one state in the country that's going to allow a school to be for-profit directly, and even those couple of states that allowed charter holders to be for-profit at one point don't anymore because federal dollars failed to go to them. There was a huge lawsuit and they had to pay it back. So start with the federal government, then the second thing is the boogeyman, and you've talked about a little bit labor in your session yesterday, but I've had legislators who are on our side say directly to me, you have to understand something. I can't go down that road. We've got to keep that ban on for-profits because, it's just better not to have it. And then we had business people like the wonderful late, great Don Fisher, who even said, there's no reason I would ever even go near for-profits. I don't want to fight that battle. So our practical solution right now is to not have that, even if that would work. I'm not sure it would. And I don't know, with Susan, whether you've encountered that in D.C. or not.
I mean, we don't see. I mean, I think Edison was the only example that we really had in D.C. and now it's Friendship and it's under. It's been revamped here in the district. So it's always, it's a tough. It's sort of just the concept is a tough pill to swallow for most people. That like if you had any extra money that you would reinvest it back into better facilities, better everything that you could do to make the best for the kids. And I think until people can get past that, it becomes a hard thing to sell.
John, you're for-profit.
Yeah, I think there's it's an emerging issue that has to be put out on front. I mean, let's just be honest about it. It's a big issue. It's addressed in every state in the country is talking about it. And the truth is that we serve nonprofit boards. So on a policy basis, every single charter is not held by Charter School USA. It's held by a nonprofit board. That nonprofit board has to have an arm's length relationship with us. Every one of those members of that board cannot be paid or associated with us, and they have to be able to hire and fire us based off performance that board director has. Do I think that's optimal? No. I'll tell you that I think in 10 years or less that there should be direct for-profits holding charters directly that have a proven track record, that have had scale, that have shown academic achievement, and hold them accountable directly with a contract, just like departments of education do for every other educational service, whether it's books, computers, or any other service they hire. There's no reason that for-profits shouldn't have direct contracts. However, because there's an evolution in the thinking, right? It's about how do you get people to understand that the idea of for-profit and nonprofit don't really matter. I mean, who pays taxes and who doesn't isn't what matters. What matters are you getting quality scale? Are you able to take what you've done in one market and transfer it to another? Because the truth is, it's not good enough to be a charter school anymore. It used to be okay. Well, we just want them because they're a charter school. Well, what does that mean? Are they going to do it better, different? What? Now what we need to do, because this movement is not a nascent industry anymore, it is now who's doing a good job, whether that's in one school or in 10 schools or in 50 schools. We have track records now. We have data. Let's go to the data. Let's look at who's doing an excellent job. Let's give them the contracts next and not approve, quite frankly, folks who have not proven themselves, because the politics of this are you can't afford anymore as legislators to go out there and take continued risk on unknowns. That was the starting point. Now it is evolving into a second generation of schools that have proven themselves and then using those across the board. Sorry.
The gentlelady from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Jeannie. Sally Kern from the Oklahoma House. When I taught school, I would tell my students there's no such thing as a stupid question, but this may really be a stupid question. And here it is. We all know that with charter schools, a big hurdle is the facilities. And so what are your thoughts on, we have inner cities all across the nation that have huge churches that are just sitting there, that have some really good facilities. Do you foresee, what do you think about, is there the possibility of maybe a charter school connecting with a church and that has adequate facilities? I'm thinking of one in Oklahoma City that's huge, has a gym, has a restaurant-style cafeteria. I mean, they could do a charter school and easily. So I know the hurdles, church and state and all that, but do you think this is an idea that is too far-fetched or something that could be explored down the road?
Susan?
Yeah, when we first opened, we opened up in a church basement, and so, but it really is a lease agreement with someone who holds real estate. So regardless if it was a church or a private owner, so that is where most charter schools get their first opportunity is in church space or commercial space, and we struggle terribly in DC to get access to the empty school buildings that are sitting here in Washington, D.C. Now we have made tremendous progress with Michelle Rhee, and we now have a gorgeous 170,000 square foot building with 7 acres of land. But it's taken 8 years for us to get there. But I will say, your question is probably, or maybe, can the church be in the business of running charter schools, or can they just rent out the space? And if it's just a space rental agreement, that's not really any more complicated than renting space for anywhere else. And in DC, we're fortunate to have a facility allowance, which a lot of states don't have, where for every child that we have, we get a certain amount of money that is supposed to be earmarked for facilities. Now, I'll say that's been threatened in the last year and has decreased for us, which has been terrible because now we are in $60 million worth of debt, having built 3 campuses, and did all of a sudden see the facility allowance go down is an interesting.
Bond fund. Tell how you did that, because most people don't do that. How
What,
did you
the
How did
facilities?
you build facilities?
Well,
Take 2 seconds.
we have for many years, we just spent time in churches, and we managed to save some money, and we were able to, because we are high performing and we have expansion plans, we were able to convince banks at a very tricky time. I pay somebody else to do this part of the organization, just so you know, Jeanne, thanks. But through bond financing, we were able to eventually get enough money to work with DCPS to get a facility from them. Which probably has a lot to do with the fact that the Chancellor, Michelle Rhee, is in place, and Adrian Fenty. I mean, we're very fortunate in Washington, D.C. to have some very progressive, like-minded, let's get behind what works people in charge right now, and we're going to do everything we can to secure as many buildings as possible. But they are definitely only looking at high-performing charter schools to do that. Did I answer your question on the facilities?
Yeah, but also when you're crafting a law, you can indeed provide incentives so that private financiers can get involved, so that you can have access to private capital. There are federal credit enhancement funds, but also states can do a lot to unlock that. And some people don't realize how many charter schools actually are rated, have bonds, are able to build facilities and pay it back on the per pupil, but the per pupil has to be substantial enough to be able to do it. So it's sort of two answers. Yeah, you can do it in the church, but also think about what happens after the church is to capacity. What happens when those people have to cover the crucifix when they walk in, or whatever there happens to be in the church. Isn't there a better way to actually build it from the ground up so that your law is good to begin with?
And then on the flip side too, in DC we have had Catholic schools convert to charter. And that was an interesting transaction. So we've had sort of the flip of charter school, Catholic schools that have said, hey, we are more sustainable if we actually become charter schools. And we had 7 or 8 become charter schools in the last year.
Thankfully, on this issue, there are tons of resources. If you all have any more questions, these folks are available on the web. Everybody in this room, you guys are terrific. Thank you for coming and being part of this.